I never imagined that the man who made me scrub toilets with a toothbrush would be the one to give me everything. My hands, calloused and perpetually smelling faintly of lemon disinfectant, had spent years perfecting the art of disappearing. I was Sarah, just Sarah, one of the countless invisible people who kept the polished surfaces of Bel Air mansions gleaming, their opulent lives undisturbed by dust or grime. My own life was a carefully balanced act of penny-pinching and pride. My tiny apartment in North Hollywood, barely big enough for my futon and a thrift store armchair, was my sanctuary from the sprawling, indifferent wealth I encountered daily. Every morning, before the sun had even thought about kissing the Hollywood hills, I was up, brewing weak coffee, packing a sad sandwich and catching the 4:45 a.m. bus. The ride was a slow ascent from the mundane to the magnificent, a stark geographical representation of the chasm between my world and theirs. Mr. Alistair Henderson's mansion was the crown jewel of my cleaning route, a sprawling Tudor estate that breathed old money and even older secrets. He was a titan of industry, or so the whispers went, a man who had built a media empire from scratch before receding into a life of solitary luxury. To me, he was just Mr. Henderson, a demanding, meticulously particular man whose eyes, even behind expensive bifocals, seemed to pierce through walls, let alone the flimsy facade of my professional politeness. He was rarely seen, yet his presence permeated every gilded room. A misplaced book, a speck of dust on a mahogany credenza, a single fingerprint on a crystal vase, nothing escaped his notice. His instructions were delivered through a grim-faced housekeeper, Mrs. Albright, herself a creature of rigid order, or occasionally a curt note left on a kitchen counter, each word perfectly aligned, a miniature testament to his unyielding control. The first fissure in my carefully maintained composure came one blistering August afternoon. I was in the main parlor, a cavernous room filled with museum-quality art and ancient Persian rugs, dusting a collection of porcelain figurines. It was meticulous work, each piece a delicate, priceless relic. Mr. Henderson, a rarity, actually entered the room. He stood there, a shadow in the doorway, observing me with an intensity that always made my skin crawl. I tried to focus, to not let my hands tremble. As I reached for a particularly fragile shepherdess, my elbow brushed against a small, ornate pedestal. A glass of iced tea, which I hadn't even realized was there, toppled over, sending a cascade of amber liquid across the pristine white marble floor and splashing onto the edge of the priceless rug. My heart hammered against my ribs. "Oh no!" I gasped, fumbling for a rag. Mr. Henderson didn't raise his voice. He didn't even move from the doorway. His words were low, measured, and cut deeper than any shout. "Sarah," he said, and the way he pronounced my name, dragging out the syllables, made it sound like an accusation. "That rug, if you bothered to learn, is a Tabriz from the 17th century. And that marble, Italian. Do you understand the value of what you've just sullied?" My face burned, a furious crimson rising from my collarbone to my hairline. I stammered an apology, rushing to blot the spill, but he wasn't finished. "You are paid handsomely, Sarah, to exercise care, to respect the objects you handle, to understand the difference between your meager possessions and my acquisitions." He paused, letting the silence hang heavy, thick with my shame. Then his voice dropped to a near whisper. "Perhaps, Sarah, you lack the finer sensibilities required for this level of work. Go and fetch the specialized cleaner. And when you return, remember that a person's worth is often reflected in the respect they show for the things they are entrusted with." His words, delivered without a shred of empathy, felt like a public flogging, even though Mrs. Albright, clearing her throat in the hallway, was the only other witness. My meager possessions, a phrase that echoed the poverty I'd fought tooth and nail against my entire life. It wasn't just about the spill. It was about his judgment of me, of my background, of my inherent ability to understand the world he inhabited. A cold knot formed in my stomach, a familiar mixture of humiliation and simmering rage. I fetched the cleaning kit, my movements stiff and deliberate, my eyes burning with unshed tears. As I scrubbed the last faint tea stain from the delicate rug, Mrs. Albright gave me a pitying look, a fleeting, almost imperceptible shake of her head. In that brief, shared moment of silent understanding, I felt a flicker of defiance ignite within me. He had judged me, diminished me, but he hadn't broken me. Not yet. I would clean his mansion, yes, but I would also remember every single slight, every dismissive glance, every word that chipped away at my dignity. The lemon scent of the cleaner suddenly felt like the bitter taste of resentment. This wasn't just a job anymore. It was a battle for my own self-worth, fought one polished surface at a time. The mansion felt less like a job site and more like a cage, gilded and grand, but a cage nonetheless, where my worth was constantly being weighed and found wanting. I was trapped, caught between needing the steady paycheck Henderson provided and the gnawing feeling that each day spent under his employ was a slow erosion of my spirit. His condescension wasn't just reserved for isolated incidents. It was woven into the fabric of the household. I'd overheard him speaking to Mrs. Albright about the staff, a collective noun delivered with an inflection that implied a species entirely separate and inferior to his own. He'd once critiqued my method of folding a towel, demonstrating with an almost surgical precision how to achieve the perfect corner, as if my primary education hadn't covered geometry. Each instance was a microaggression, a tiny cut that over time bled into a persistent wound. I found myself walking on eggshells, not out of respect, but out of a desperate need to avoid further verbal lashings. The mansion itself was a museum of Henderson's life, or at least the life he presented to the world. Every room seemed to tell a story of success, of exquisite taste, of cold, hard power. Yet there was an emptiness to it, a pervasive silence that even my own cleaning equipment couldn't quite fill. The grand ballroom, with its polished parquet floor and crystal chandeliers, rarely saw a dance. The sprawling library, filled with first editions and leather-bound tomes, seemed untouched, more for show than for reading. I often wondered if he truly lived in that house, or merely existed within its gilded confines. Was this what wealth brought you? This gilded cage of solitude? One Tuesday, I was methodically wiping down the antique wooden banister, the grain smooth beneath my cloth, when I heard snippets of a phone conversation drifting from his study, the door ajar. Mr. Henderson's voice was lower than usual, tinged with a brittle edge I hadn't heard before. "No, Eleanor, not a single penny more. You've made your choices, now live with them." There was a pause, filled with the tinny sound of a distant, agitated voice. Then his reply, sharper this time. "My legacy is my own to decide, and it will not involve bailing out your feckless son again. He chose his path just as you chose yours." The door clicked shut with a definitive thud, cutting off the rest of the conversation. Eleanor, a daughter, a sister. The tone of his voice, cold and final, suggested a deep, festering rift, a family fractured beyond repair. It was a fleeting glimpse into his personal world, a momentary crack in the impenetrable facade, but it was enough to spark my curiosity, though it did little to soften my resentment. The accumulated slights, the casual dismissals, the sheer emotional weight of his judgment, it all became too much. One evening, after a particularly exhausting shift, where he had left a passive-aggressive note about the unacceptable streak on a mirror I had spent 20 minutes perfecting, I sat in my cramped apartment, staring at the chipped paint on my walls. My hands still throbbed, my back ached, but it was my spirit that felt most bruised. "That's it," I whispered into the quiet air, the words tasting like freedom and fear simultaneously. I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't trade my dignity for his dollars. I pulled out a crumpled sheet of notebook paper and a pen, my resignation letter. It was simple, direct. 2 weeks' notice. No explanation, just a polite but firm declaration of my departure. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a flush of rebellion. This was my way out, my self-preservation. I wasn't going to be subjected to his condescension anymore. I was going to find another cleaning job, one where I was treated like a human being, not a sentient tool. The next morning, armed with my resolve and the carefully folded letter in my pocket, I arrived at the mansion, a nervous knot twisting in my stomach. I cleaned with a renewed sense of purpose, each swipe of the cloth a silent farewell. When it was time for my break, I walked to the kitchen, where I knew Mr. Henderson often had his morning tea. He was there, surprisingly, sitting at the massive granite island, reading the Wall Street Journal, a pair of reading glasses perched on his nose. My breath hitched. This was it. I approached him, the letter feeling like a hot coal in my palm. "Mr. Henderson," I began, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. He lowered his paper, his eyes sharp and unyielding fixed on me. "Yes, Sarah." I swallowed, pushing the letter across the polished counter towards him. I'm giving my 2 weeks' notice." He picked up the letter, unfolded it, and read it slowly, his expression unchanging. The silence stretched unbearable, punctuated only by the ticking of an unseen grandfather clock. Then he looked up, his gaze piercing. "Is there a problem, Sarah?" he asked, his voice devoid of emotion. I hesitated, wanting to unleash all my pent-up frustrations, but years of ingrained deference held me back. "No, sir, I've just decided to pursue other opportunities." He nodded slowly, then placed the letter back on the counter next to his teacup. "I see." Another pause. "Well, Sarah, you're a diligent worker and reliable. Good cleaners are hard to come by." He reached into his blazer pocket and pulled out a checkbook. He began to write. My eyes widened. Was he going to pay me off? Was this his way of dismissing my departure, making it about money rather than my dignity? He tore off the check and handed it to me. "This is a bonus, Sarah. A little something extra for your loyalty, and a slight raise, effective immediately, should you reconsider. Think on it. Opportunities, as you say, are fleeting. A steady job with good pay in this economy, less so." He didn't acknowledge my grievances, he didn't apologize for his behavior. He simply offered money, a cold, calculated transaction that completely sidestepped the core issue of my self-respect. It was a false resolution, a dismissal of my feelings, yet a tempting offer given my financial precarity. I looked at the check, a significant sum, more than I made in a month. My resolve wavered. A small part of me wanted to tear it up, to throw it back in his face, to prove that my dignity was not for sale. But the image of my tiny apartment, the stack of overdue bills, the empty pantry, flashed through my mind. I was trapped. He knew it. He saw my struggle and used his wealth to reinforce his power, to buy my silence and continued service. I tucked the check into my pocket, feeling a wave of defeat wash over me. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson," I mumbled, the words tasting like ash. He gave a curt nod, then returned to his newspaper, the brief interruption already dismissed from his mind. My attempt at escape had failed. I was back where I started, only now with a heavier heart and a deeper understanding of the golden handcuffs that bound me. Years ago, when I was just a kid, maybe 10 or 11, my mom used to work 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. We lived in a cramped little house in Pasadena, and I remember one particularly bad Christmas. My mom had been laid off from her factory job, and there wasn't enough money for presents, let alone a proper holiday meal. I was sitting on the stoop, tears silently tracing paths down my cheeks, when Mrs. Rodriguez, our elderly neighbor, came out with a plate of her homemade tamales. She saw my face, sat down beside me, and without saying a word, she wrapped an arm around my shoulders. "Mia," she said softly, "life can be tough, but you gotta remember, you're tougher. Don't let anyone ever make you feel small, you hear me? You got a fire in you, Sarah. Don't let anyone put it out." That memory, her warm embrace, her unwavering belief in my strength, had been a constant companion, a quiet mantra I'd repeated to myself countless times. It was a promise I'd made to her and to myself that I would never truly let anyone extinguish that fire. Yet standing in Mr. Henderson's kitchen, with his bonus check burning a hole in my pocket, I felt that fire dimming, flickering precariously. The shame of accepting his money, after all his cutting remarks, felt like a betrayal of that little girl on the stoop. Over the next few months, I noticed a subtle shift in Mr. Henderson. His previously rigid schedule seemed to unravel. He started spending more time in his study, sometimes leaving the door ajar, and I'd hear the faint strains of classical music, something I'd never associated with his stern persona. He looked frailer, his skin taking on a papery quality, his once sharp eyes seeming to retreat deeper into their sockets. He still made his demands, still found the occasional flaw, but there was a weariness to his voice, a lack of his usual venom. He stopped having his regular business associates over, and the house, already quiet, descended into an even deeper, more profound silence. The only person I ever saw him truly interact with was his lawyer, a stern man named Mr. Finch, who arrived with thick briefcases and left with an even more somber expression. One chilly morning, while cleaning his study, a room I usually avoided due to its oppressive atmosphere, I found a framed photograph tucked behind a stack of financial reports on his desk. It was an old, faded picture, yellowed with age. In it, a young Mr. Henderson, perhaps in his 20s, stood beside a beautiful woman with a radiant smile, holding hands with a little girl who couldn't have been more than 5. The child had bright, curious eyes, an undeniable resemblance to Mr. Henderson, and her arm was wrapped around a scruffy golden retriever. A happy family, frozen in time, a stark contrast to the solitary, imposing figure I knew. My fingers traced the outline of the child's face. Who were they? Why had I never seen this picture before? It was a micro-trigger, a tiny window into a hidden past, a momentary crack in the man's formidable armor that sparked a flicker of genuine curiosity, a softening of my hardened heart. My resentment didn't disappear, but it was momentarily overshadowed by a nascent sense of intrigue. The changes in him continued. He started leaving small, almost imperceptible notes for me, not about cleaning, but about trivial things. "Sarah, the jasmine tea is running low," or "Could you ensure the library window is latched? The nights are getting cold." It was unusual, a shift from his usual impersonal commands. Other staff members, those who had been with him longer than I had, whispered amongst themselves, "He's not long for this world, bless his heart." The gardener, old Miguel, murmured to Mrs. Albright one afternoon, "Lost his spark. Ever since, well, you know." Mrs. Albright just shook her head, a grim set to her lips, but offered no further explanation. It hinted at a past tragedy, a defining event that had shaped the man, but I was still very much on the outside, peering through a heavily frosted pane of glass. Then, one Tuesday, I arrived at the mansion and the gates were closed. Wrapped with a solemn black ribbon, a small notice was taped to the intercom. "The Henderson estate regrets to announce the passing of Mr. Alistair Henderson. All services are temporarily suspended." My breath hitched. He was gone. The news hit me with a strange mix of shock and a hollow, unexpected ache. He had been a cruel employer, yes, but he had also been a constant, a formidable presence in my life for years. And now, silence. The grand house stood sentinel, its windows dark, reflecting the grey morning sky. I felt a wave of confusion. What now? Would I get my final paycheck? Would they sell the mansion? My mind raced through the practicalities, but beneath it, a deeper current swirled. An unsettling sense of closure that felt anything but complete. A week later, a formal letter arrived at my tiny apartment, the embossed crest of a prestigious law firm on the envelope. My hands trembled as I opened it. It was an invitation, a summons, to the reading of Mr. Alistair Henderson's last will and testament. "Your presence is required," it stated, in no uncertain terms. Required? Why me? I was just the cleaner. My heart hammered with a mixture of apprehension and a strange, burgeoning hope. Perhaps it was a final bonus, a small acknowledgement of my years of service. But the formality of the invitation, the insistence on my presence, hinted at something more. The day of the will reading was a surreal blur. I arrived at the imposing law offices downtown, feeling utterly out of place in my best, albeit slightly worn dress. The waiting room was filled with the icy glares of Mr. Henderson's estranged family. A sharp-faced woman I vaguely recognized as Eleanor from his phone call, her perpetually disgruntled husband, and a smirking young man with a carelessly expensive suit, presumably her son. Their disdain for me was palpable, a silent judgment that felt like a familiar, heavy cloak. Mr. Finch, the lawyer, a man whose expression was carved from stone, ushered us into a somber boardroom. The air crackled with tension and unspoken animosity. Mr. Finch cleared his throat, adjusting his spectacles. He began to read, his voice dry and devoid of emotion, listing assets, charities, minor bequests to distant cousins. The family members shifted impatiently, their eyes fixed on him, waiting for the big reveal, the lion's share. Then Mr. Finch paused, his gaze sweeping over the room, landing finally on me. My heart gave a frantic thump. "And finally," he stated, his voice gaining a fraction of volume, "to my loyal and dedicated employee, Sarah Miller, who has, despite her humble beginnings, always maintained a steadfast work ethic and a quiet strength that I have come to respect in my final years." My breath caught in my throat. He was speaking about me, the lawyer continued. "I hereby bequeath to Sarah Miller my beloved estate located at 1450 Meadowbrook Drive, Bel Air, California, along with all its contents, furnishings, and art collections, and furthermore, a trust fund established in her name, comprising 80% of my remaining liquid assets." The words hit me like a physical blow, a sudden dizzying rush that stole the air from my lungs. The room erupted. Eleanor shrieked, her face a mask of furious disbelief. "What? The cleaner? This is outrageous. A cruel joke. My father would never." Her son slammed his fist on the polished table, his smirking facade collapsing into enraged fury. "This is a farce. She's a gold digger. He must have been senile." Their accusations, their outrage, swirled around me like a maelstrom, but I barely registered them. My mind was reeling, struggling to comprehend. The mansion, my mansion, 80% of his fortune. The truth had come to light, twisting the roles of victim and culprit, of the powerful and the powerless, into an unrecognizable tangle. I, Sarah Miller, the invisible cleaner, was now the heiress. The world as I knew it had just been irrevocably flipped on its head. The lawyer's voice, a calm island amidst the rising storm of the Henderson family's protests, continued to drone, outlining the legal specifics. But his words were muffled, distant, drowned out by the ringing in my ears. Eleanor, her face blotchy with rage, lunged across the table only to be restrained by her husband, who was yelling about undue influence and fraud. Her son, pale with fury, jabbed a finger in my direction. "You tricked him, didn't you, you little conniver? You preyed on an old man's weakness." I sat there, utterly numb, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, feeling the blood drain from my face. This wasn't a dream, it was a nightmare, a gilded, impossibly luxurious nightmare. I was a deer caught in headlights, suddenly thrust into the harsh glare of public scrutiny. The news spread like wildfire. "Cleaner inherits billionaire's fortune," screamed the headlines from tabloids I'd never even glanced at. My face, usually unremarkable, was plastered across front pages, juxtaposed with photos of the Bel Air mansion. Reporters camped outside my tiny apartment building, snapping pictures, shouting questions, digging into my past. Every detail of my humble life, from my modest upbringing to my years of cleaning, was suddenly fair game, dissected and sensationalized. I became an overnight sensation, a Cinderella story warped by suspicion and contempt. Mr. Finch, bless his perpetually unimpressed soul, became my reluctant shield. He arranged for security, a temporary move to a discreet hotel, and fielded the relentless onslaught of legal challenges and media queries. "They'll fight this, Miss Miller," he warned me, his voice as dry as parchment, tooth and nail. "They believe you exploited Mr. Henderson. They believe he was not of sound mind." I didn't blame them. From their perspective, it was a preposterous, insulting turn of events. To them, I was nothing, an interloper, a common thief masquerading as an unassuming cleaner. The mansion, now officially mine, felt like a vast, echoing tomb. I walked its halls, not with a cleaning rag, but with a bewildered sense of ownership. Every polished surface, every priceless artifact seemed to mock me, a testament to a life I didn't understand and hadn't asked for. The immense wealth felt less like a blessing and more like an anchor, dragging me down into a sea of judgment and unwanted attention. I tried to make sense of it, tried to understand why Mr. Henderson would do such a thing. Was it a final, elaborate joke, a twisted form of philanthropy, or something else entirely? The truth was still shrouded in mystery, hidden behind the opulent walls of his legacy. One afternoon, a few weeks after the will reading, after the initial storm had somewhat subsided, I found myself in Mr. Henderson's study again. This time, I wasn't just cleaning, I was searching for answers. I opened every drawer, examined every book, every ornament. The room was still heavy with his presence, the scent of old paper and expensive leather clinging to the air. I found a small hidden compartment behind a loose panel in his antique desk. Inside, nestled among faded letters and old photographs, was a worn, leather-bound journal. My heart pounded as I opened it. It wasn't a diary in the traditional sense, but a series of disjointed thoughts, reflections, and dates. Most of it was in his precise, spidery handwriting, but one particular entry, dated almost 30 years ago, stood out. "The deepest cut," it began, "is self-inflicted. Her smile, her laugh, gone. My pride, my ambition, destroyed them both. My beautiful Elizabeth. My sweet Lily, I pushed them away, chased them out, and now all I have left is this empty house and the echoes of what could have been. Elizabeth, Lily." The name struck me with a chilling familiarity. I remembered the faded photograph I had found months ago. The beautiful woman, the smiling little girl. This was his family, his wife and daughter. His words painted a picture of regret, of self-blame, a stark contrast to the unfeeling magnate I knew. A micro-trigger, indeed. This journal entry was a crack in his hardened exterior, a raw, emotional revelation that began to chip away at my preconceived notions of him. It didn't excuse his cruelty, but it provided a context, a tragic backdrop to his solitary existence. He hadn't just lost them, he had driven them away. The immense wealth, the sprawling mansion, suddenly seemed less like symbols of power and more like monuments to his profound loneliness and regret. I felt a strange stirring within me, a complex mix of pity and lingering resentment. The man I had hated, the man who had humiliated me, was also a man who carried a devastating burden, a ghost of a past he couldn't escape. The narrative was shifting, not just his story, but mine as well. My journey from anonymous cleaner to reluctant heiress was forcing me to confront not just his secrets, but my own capacity for judgment, my own prejudices against the wealthy. The journal in my hands was slowly, painfully revealing the hidden man behind the mask of the millionaire, and with it, challenging the very foundation of my understanding of him. The more I delved into Alistair Henderson's journal, the more a tragic narrative unfolded. He wrote about his early days, ambitious and ruthless, driven by a desire to escape his own humble beginnings, a striking parallel to my own aspirations. But his ambition, he confessed, had devoured his personal life. He'd neglected Elizabeth, his vivacious wife, and their bright-eyed daughter Lily, in pursuit of an empire. He recounted heated arguments, missed birthdays, and the crushing realization that his family was slipping away. One particularly heart-wrenching entry described the day Elizabeth left him, taking Lily with her. Her eyes held no anger, he wrote, only pity, and that, I found, was 1,000 times worse. I stood amidst my growing fortune, and for the first time felt truly poor. He never remarried, never had other children. His empire grew, yes, but his soul, by his own admission, withered. He wrote about the silence that filled the mansion after they left, a silence he tried to fill with art, with business, with the endless accumulation of wealth, but it was a silence that only grew louder with each passing year. Then I found it. Tucked between the pages of the journal, a letter, handwritten and addressed to me. To Sarah Miller, it began, his familiar, precise script, yet imbued with a vulnerability I had never witnessed. If you are reading this, then my last wishes have been honored. I know you view me as a cold and demanding man. You are not entirely wrong. My life became a monument to my own folly, a gilded cage built with the bricks of regret. My ambition cost me everything that truly mattered. I saw in you, Sarah, a reflection of my younger self, the fire, the determination, the drive to rise above your circumstances. But I also saw something else, a capacity for compassion that I, long ago, suffocated within myself. My family, Eleanor and her son, represent the bitter fruits of my detachment. They resent me, and rightly so. They will squander this fortune not out of malice, but out of a misguided sense of entitlement I fostered in them. I cannot undo the past, but perhaps I can in this final act salvage a shred of meaning from my desolate life. The inheritance is not a reward for your servitude, Sarah. It is a burden, a test. I am entrusting you with this fortune, not to possess it, but to redeem it. Use it wisely, use it for good. Do what I failed to do. Build something with heart, something that truly lasts beyond the fleeting accumulation of wealth. Perhaps in doing so you can find a peace I never did. Perhaps you can, in some small way, forgive the man who never learned how to truly live, only how to acquire. Reading his confession, his raw honesty, was like being struck by lightning. The resentment I had harbored for so long, the anger at his humiliation, began to crumble, replaced by a profound and overwhelming wave of empathy. My initial judgment of him, while born from his own cruel behavior, was incomplete, a surface-level assessment. I had seen the tyrant, but not the broken man beneath, haunted by the ghosts of his past. My own struggles, my pride, my fierce independence had blinded me to a deeper, hidden suffering in him. I realized the limitations of my own perspective, my own quickness to condemn, based on superficial interactions. He had been cruel, yes, but his cruelty was a symptom of his own immense pain, a self-inflicted wound that had festered for decades. My flaw was realizing that I had judged him not as a complex, suffering human being, but as a caricature of the wealthy elite. I had allowed my own resentment to overshadow the possibility of understanding, of compassion. It was a humbling, gut-wrenching realization. Honestly, it's easy to hate the rich, isn't it? To assume their lives are perfect, their hearts cold, their problems trivial. We see the mansions, the cars, the designer clothes, and we construct a narrative of effortless happiness, of lives untouched by struggle. But what if they're just as broken, just as lost as anyone else, just hiding it behind $1,000 suit and a veneer of power? What if their wealth is less a source of joy and more a gilded prison, a monument to their deepest regrets? Could you have seen it? Could you have looked past the condescension, the dismissive glares, the casual cruelty, and seen the gaping hole in Alistair Henderson's heart? I don't know if I could have, not truly, not without his final, heartbreaking confession. The mansion, the fortune, they were no longer just symbols of his power. They were tangible manifestations of his profound loss, his lifelong penance. And now, They were mine, a legacy of regret that I was somehow meant to transform into something meaningful. The weight of it pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. The overwhelming weight of the inheritance was almost unbearable. The mansion, its sprawling grounds, the dizzying zeros in the bank accounts, it felt less like a gift and more like a colossal responsibility, a moral labyrinth I was now compelled to navigate. Mr. Henderson's letter, with its plea to redeem the fortune, echoed in my mind. What did that even mean? Should I establish a grand foundation in his name, a public act of philanthropy that would undoubtedly draw more scrutiny? Should I quietly divest, giving the money away to causes I believed in, thus rejecting the very symbol of his wealth? Or should I keep it, claiming my new status, but living with the constant judgment of his family and the cynical gaze of the world? The dilemma gnawed at me, a constant internal debate between personal gain, honoring his complex, conflicted legacy, and my own conscience. His family, true to form, didn't give up easily. Eleanor, fueled by venomous outrage, launched a full-scale legal challenge, citing diminished capacity and undue influence. Her lawyers, slick and aggressive, painted me as a manipulative opportunist who had preyed on a lonely, vulnerable old man. I was forced to sit through depositions, to recount my interactions with Mr. Henderson, to defend my character against their baseless accusations. It was grueling, humiliating, and reinforced the chasm between our worlds. "You're nothing but a gold digger," Eleanor shrieked at me during one heated exchange in Mr. Finch's office, her face inches from mine. "You'll never belong in this world. You're still just a cleaner." Her words, intended to wound, somehow felt hollow now. I knew their pain, their perceived injustice, but I also knew the truth of Alistair Henderson's profound regret. One evening, after another draining day of legal battles, I found myself alone in the mansion's grand ballroom. The vast space, usually filled with shadows, felt particularly cavernous and silent. I stood in the center of the polished floor, the moonlight streaming through the towering windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The silence was deafening, amplified by the sheer scale of the room. I felt utterly, profoundly alone. All this wealth, this grandeur, and for what? Alistair Henderson had died in this vast, empty house, surrounded by his treasures, yet devoid of true connection. Was this my fate too? To inherit his fortune, only to inherit his profound loneliness? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. It was a powerful micro-trigger, forcing me to confront the true cost of his legacy and the potential price of my own path forward. The choice I had to make wasn't just about money. It was about the kind of life I wanted to lead, the kind of person I wanted to become. The answer came to me in the quiet stillness of that ballroom, not as a sudden epiphany, but as a slow, steady realization. Mr. Henderson had given me a trust, but he had also given me a task to redeem what he had lost. His wealth had been accumulated at the expense of his soul, his family, his happiness. I couldn't undo his past, but I could redefine the future of his legacy. I decided not to squander it, not to hoard it, and not to simply give it away without purpose. I would keep the mansion, not as a symbol of personal wealth, but as a center for something greater. I would transform it into a foundation dedicated to empowering women from disadvantaged backgrounds, providing education, resources, and mentorship, something that would foster the very compassion and connection Alistair Henderson had yearned for, but never found. I would use his money, his resources, to light the fire in others, a fire that had once nearly been extinguished in me. My decision was met with varying reactions. Eleanor and her son continued their legal fight, though the discovery of Mr. Henderson's journal, outlining his reasons, weakened their case considerably. The public remained divided, some hailing me as a visionary, others dismissing me as a shrewd opportunist, but I no longer cared about their judgment. This was my choice, an emotional one, guided by his heartbreaking confession and my own hard-won understanding. I would honor his unstated wish, not by clinging to his wealth, but by transforming it, giving it a purpose beyond mere accumulation. I would take the mansion and infuse it with life, with learning, with the laughter he had driven from its halls decades ago. I would clean it, not with disinfectant and resentment, but with purpose and the promise of a brighter future for others. The choice felt right. A challenging path, yes, but one that finally, truly aligned with my conscience. It was the hardest choice I'd ever made, and yet, in the heart of that silent ballroom, it also felt like the only choice. The day I stood before the small gathering of architects, contractors, and local community leaders, outlining my vision for the Alistair Henderson Legacy Foundation, my voice wavered only slightly. The mansion, once a symbol of immense, isolating wealth, was about to be reborn. Its grand halls would echo with the sounds of learning, collaboration, and hope, rather than the profound silence of a lonely man's regret. I spoke about second chances, about the power of education, and about lifting up those who, like my younger self, were fighting to prove their worth in a world that often sought to diminish them. As I finished, a wave of profound emotion washed over me, a quiet internal collapse. I wasn't weeping, but my eyes burned with unshed tears, a testament to the journey that had brought me to this moment. I looked around the study, still filled with Mr. Henderson's personal effects, now carefully organized by Mr. Finch. My gaze fell upon the faded photograph of young Alistair, Elizabeth and Lily, and a single perfectly polished silver frame on his desk, untouched, exactly as he had left it. I felt a surge of acceptance, a silent apology to his memory, and a deep acknowledgement of the man he was, broken and flawed, but ultimately capable of a profound act of redemption. The mansion underwent a slow, deliberate transformation. The ballroom, once used for grand, forgotten parties, became a lecture hall. The library, no longer just for show, was filled with new books, computers, and the eager faces of women hungry for knowledge. The formal dining room, which had hosted dinners for a solitary man, was converted into a communal kitchen where budding chefs learned their craft. His family's legal challenge eventually failed. Eleanor and her son, defeated and still bitter, retreated from the public eye, their inheritance severely diminished by their own legal fees and their father's carefully crafted will. They never forgave me, but their animosity no longer held the same power over me. I was no longer just the cleaner in their eyes, nor in my own. I was the steward of a complex legacy, a paradox of wealth born from profound sadness, now being repurposed for good. Life in the mansion was no longer solitary. It buzzed with activity, with the energy of purpose. I had found a new community within its walls, a connection that Alistair Henderson himself had yearned for but never achieved. Yet the vastness of the estate, the lingering echoes of his life, sometimes still caught me unawares. In the quiet hours, when the students and staff had left for the day and I walked the hushed corridors, I would sometimes pause, looking out at the manicured gardens, thinking of the man who had built this empire, who had lived and died within these very walls. I wasn't rich in the way he was, not anymore. My focus was on giving, on building, on creating opportunities, not accumulating more. The mansion was no longer a gilded cage, it was a beacon. And so I inherited a fortune, a mansion, and a truth I never expected. Was it justice? Was it a second chance? Or just another twist of fate? A final, elaborate lesson from a man who had more money than love? What would you have called it, knowing everything I know now? The mansion was mine, the fortune secure, repurposed, alive with new meaning. But sometimes, when the wind howled through those now vibrant halls, I wondered if the true inheritance wasn't the money at all, but the ghost of a lonely man's unlived life, finally perhaps free.